I like my Spotify Discover Weekly playlist, and some weeks I just forget to save the songs and poof, they're gone the next week. Like, I'm a programmer, I can automate this, so let me show you how I did it. Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. I know it's been a while since I posted, but here we are doing a tutorial today. Today we're going to be writing a Python script that connects to and uses the Spotify API. And this was actually my first time working with this API, and I will tell you, there were some things that I struggled with, specifically with the authorization. And so I'm hoping this tutorial will really help clarify some of those things. Actually, in the middle of me recording this, Spotify actually changed their documentation. I think it's a little bit better now. So shall we get started? You thought that we were going to jump straight into programming, but planning and programming is pretty important, and I want to reiterate that here. We need to have an idea of what we're doing and how we're going to do it before we put our hands on the keyboard. So I'm going to show you how I plan this out step by step. Initially, when I had the idea of I want to do this, I didn't know if it was even possible. And so we're going to explore the Spotify documentation together. I'm going to show you some cool features. Let's get into it. So I start off by looking at the Spotify API documentation, and for this project we need to get my Discover Weekly playlist information, get all the songs in that playlist, and be able to transfer them into a Save Weekly playlist. So here on the left we have a section in the API documentation for playlists. In order to get here I had to go to Docs, Web API, and Reference. Now that I'm here, I'm going to expand this list, and here's a bunch of different requests that you can make associated with playlists in Spotify. And specifically, we want to take a look at this Get Playlist Items because we want to get the Discover Weekly playlist items. So here on the right, you have this request that is the full request, the URL that you'll have to enter in order to get this data. And here's an example of what the data returned will look like. You can see here there's one required parameter to this endpoint, which is the playlist ID. So in order to get playlist items, you have to know the playlist ID, which is in this format here. Oh, and here there's another endpoint that's get current users playlists that will allow us to get all of our current playlists to then find the Discover Weekly playlist. And here you'll see that it returns a list of items, and in that list for each playlist it returns the playlist ID. So we're going to have to essentially call this first to get all of the users' playlists. Then we're going to have to programmatically go through this list and find the Discover Weekly playlist name. Here's the name, and where it matches we will grab that ID and save it so that then we can go back to this other request and actually get the playlist items of the Discover Weekly playlist. So now that we found the endpoints that give us the Discover Weekly playlist and its current tracks, what's next? Well, now we need to be able to add this list of songs to a new playlist. And first, we need to check if that playlist exists. We're going to call this new playlist Save Weekly, and the goal is to push all the new tracks to the same playlist every week. The first thing we need to do here is we need to see if the Save Weekly playlist has been created, and if it hasn't, then we need to create that Save Weekly playlist. If the playlist does exist, we need to get its playlist ID the same way that we get the Discover Weekly playlist ID through the API. Here we have the Create Playlist, which will allow us to actually create the Save Weekly playlist if it doesn't yet exist. And once that's created, we can now look at this endpoint here, which is add items to playlist. And this is where we're going to be able to take all of the items from the Discover Weekly playlist and add them to our new playlist. One thing to pay attention to here is these URIs. And so if I zoom in here, you'll see this is the structure of what it's expecting for the tracks that are added to the new playlist. We originally get the playlist items from our Discover Weekly playlist. Here in the response example, we see that each item has a URI property. So we're going to have to pull each and every URI from this Discover Weekly playlist, save it, call this request to add the items to the playlist. So a quick recap of everything that we're trying to do. Step one, we're going to get all of the users' playlists, and we're going to find the Discover Weekly playlist ID from that list. We're going to find the Save Weekly playlist ID if the Save Weekly playlist exists. If it doesn't, we're going to create the Save Weekly playlist. The next step is going to be taking all of the items inside of the Discover Weekly playlist, taking those track URIs and saving them into a list, and then taking that list and adding it to the Save Weekly playlist. And that is practically all the steps, right? One more important detail. You'll notice in almost all of the API requests, there's this lock button here with OAuth right next to it, which means that we need to implement OAuth, which will allow us to use these endpoints because we need to have the user's permission
to modify their playlist and do all this stuff. Before we get to the programming portion, there's actually one more thing that I want to show you on the Spotify developer site. There's this tab, you can click on it, Console, where you can actually test out some of the API endpoints before you start programming. So here, for example, if we want to get all of my current playlists, well, the first thing I have to do is create this auth token here. So you're going to want to click Get Token, and it's going to generate through your Spotify account a token that's only going to last you an hour. This one is not a long-lasting token. And then you're going to go ahead and adjust these settings and click Try It, and you'll see down here it'll give you your current playlists. So for example, it's giving me January 2023 as the name of the playlist. That's my display name and all the information about that specific playlist here. I think this is a cool way to play around with the API, because then, like, if you want to try something out, you get to see what the data looks like coming back, so that when you have to do something with it programmatically, you'll know what the structure looks like. That's always good. It is time to code! Alright, so getting started on the tutorial, first things first is you're going to want to make sure that you have the right settings on your machine to do this project. So first you want to make sure that you have Python installed, specifically Python 3, and if you're not sure if you have Python already installed on your machine, you can go to your terminal, you can type in the command python-v, and if it says command not found, then you can also try python 3-v, and if it says command not found again, then you need to install Python on your computer. And I'm actually not going to cover exactly how to do that today, but I did link 2 helpful videos in the description. One is for Mac and one is for Windows, and so you can go ahead and check those out and come back to this video. Second thing that you're going to want to have is a Spotify account. If you don't have one already, create one. I'll be honest with you, I don't know if the Discover Weekly playlist will be available to you from day one. The way that the Discover Weekly playlist works is you get a song selection curated for you based off of the songs that you've liked and listened to in the past. So if you have 0 song history and it's your first day on Spotify, I actually don't know if it's going to give you a Discover Weekly playlist. Let me know in the comment section if that's a problem. The third thing is you're going to want to make sure that you have some sort of code editor installed on your machine. If you don't, then I have linked down below Visual Studio Code. That's what I'm going to be using today. I've been using Visual Studio Code for years. Okay, to start, we're going to use 2 imported libraries in our project today. One of them is going to be Spotify and the other is going to be Flask. So we're going to start by importing Spotify. Spotify library is a Python Spotify library. Isn't that confusing? That makes it easier to just work with the Spotify API in general. And specifically, I think Spotify is so helpful with the OAuth. And we're going to need to import one more variable specifically for the OAuth, which is spotify.oauth2 import Spotify OAuth. I feel like that's all a tongue twister. The second library that we're going to import is going to be Flask. So from Flask, import Flask. And I'm going to add a couple more imports here from the Flask library. Don't worry about them. We're going to use them. We're going to talk about them. For session redirect. Alrighty. Make sure that we actually have these libraries installed. So to do that, in your terminal, you're going to go ahead and run a command. In there, you're going to run pip install Flask space Spotify. Make sure you write Spotify instead of Spotify. I know it's confusing. The naming is great, but confusing. Here's the next step. You're going to have to create an app inside of the Spotify for Developers dashboard. You're going to go to navigate to this URL here. I have linked this down in my description down below. We're going to log in and create a new app. We're going to call it Discover Weekly, actually we're going to call it this, Discover Weekly YouTube version. We're going to give our app a description, like what does our app do? Save my Discover Weekly playlist every week. You don't need to fill out this website here, but the redirect URI is something that we will need thanks to the client ID and the client secret that we will actually end up using in our code here in just a second. But if you go to the settings, you'll see that there's client ID here and down below is the client secret. The purpose of this tutorial, I will show you the client secret, we'll be working with it, but understand that you cannot use the same client ID and secret that I'm using because by the time you watch this tutorial, this application that I created will not exist any longer. In fact, if you are new to programming, you need to know that the client secret is something that you never share with others and it should not be publicly available for others to see. So just keep that in mind. All right, so now that we have this information, we can go ahead and continue with our project. We are going to initialize the Flask application by creating an instance of the Flask class and assigning it to a variable app. So Flask. This is initializing our Flask application. The only reason that we're using Flask here is really for the OAuth. This was really the one way that I could think of where you could truly automate the process, where the user has to authorize once. And so when we use the OAuth and we get it working here, it will give us a token value, which will allow our user to stay signed in to the application. So we're gonna need to store that token somewhere, and Flask will allow us to store this in a session. To set that up, we have to actually give our session cookie a name and a secret. So I'm gonna say app.config session cookie name equal to whatever you want to name your session cookie. App.secret key. Secret key can really be any value. Like I'm just going to plug in some random numbers and values here. I'm making it a long string that is not easily guessable. This random value that we're assigning, the secret key, is going to be used to sign the cookie. This is mainly just used to prevent unauthorized access to the cookie by creating a secure digital signature. If I were you, I wouldn't be too worried about really understanding the details of how the session works. If you're curious, go watch a YouTube video on it. But all you need to know is that you have a token that you need to save in order for the user to stay authorized to use your app. That token is being stored in something called a session. The next thing that we actually will need here is token info constant that we are going to store the token info information in. But for now, before we even have that, we're just going to set it to like just a random string, token info. Next, we're going to give our Flask application some routes. We're going to create 3 routes. The first is going to be the home route. Next, we'll have the redirect route. The third route that we're going to introduce is going to be the save, discover, weekly route, which once the user is already authorized to use your app, here we'll add the functionality to actually save the Discover Weekly playlist every week. Okay, a couple lines down, I'm just going to create this function that's going to create the Spotify OAuth. I'm going to name it create Spotify OAuth. So this function, the Spotify OAuth, we're going to use it here. Spotify. I keep thinking Spotify, it's so hard. The cool thing about VS Code here is it'll actually tell you what parameters you need to add. So for example here, it shows the structure, and then if you scroll down a little, you'll see these are the required or optional parameters that this function takes. So let's go ahead and add those in here now. The client ID, the value that you're getting from your Spotify developer dashboard. I'm gonna copy that client ID. You're gonna paste it right in. It's a string. To make things more readable, I'm just gonna put each one on a new line. Client secret. Once again, we just go to our dashboard and we copy the value and we paste it in. Redirect URI. We are going to say URL for redirect, which is going to take this route. We haven't built anything out here yet, but it's going to take with the functionality of this route, specify it here. For our specific use case today, we're going to be using 3 scopes. The first one that we're going to need is user library read, which is going to allow us to read our users' playlist information, songs, all of that. Second one is playlist modify public. And the last one will be playlist modify private. These scopes specifically pertain to the purpose of our project. So if you're trying to do something else with Spotify, make sure that you read the documentation, it's linked below, with the scope that you are specifically looking for. Totally forgot a comma here. Now that we've created this, we can go up here to the home route, and here when we create a function right underneath the route, this function will be called when the address to this route is reached here. So this login function, we're going to create a variable called auth_url. I'll explain what this does in just a second. We're going to use the function that we just created, create Spotify OAuth. And we are going to use this function that is off of this Spotify OAuth library method, and it's called getAuthorize URL. GetAuthorize URL is going to essentially do what the function name says. It's going to generate an authorization URL. And in the next line, we're just going to say, okay, return redirect to auth URL. This line on line 14, we are just getting the value of the URL that we're going to transfer the user to, and on line 15, we are actually sending them there. So we're redirecting the user to that external URL. Now let's set up our redirect route. To also create a function here, we'll call it redirect. And so when we hit the redirect URL, it will call this function similar to how when you hit this home route, it will call the login function. I'm going to clear any existing sessions. And so this makes sure that any existing user data that may be stored in the session is cleared away. Then we're going to set this variable called code equals request.args.get code. On line 20, the auth code that was included in the request parameters is extracted using the request args get method and stored in the code variable. So next we're going to get the token. To do that, we're going to create another variable and create Spotify OAuth get underscore access token, and we're going to input code as the argument, that variable. So this get access token that is on the create Spotify OAuth object is passing in the code variable, and what this method will do is it exchanges the auth code for an access token that we're going to store inside of this token info variable. And then session token info equals token info. So here we're going to take the token info variable and then we're going to store it in our session. Just write return redirect URL for save discover weekly external true. So in the redirect, we have set it up to where once it gets back the information from the OAuth, it goes ahead and saves that token info, but we also need to be able to get that token info when we need to. So we're going to create a function to get the more function now. We're going to call it get token. So here I'm declaring a variable token info, setting it to session.get token info. This is just going in and retrieving our token. But one thing that we need to pay attention to is what if the token either doesn't exist or if the token is expired, we need to get a refresh token. If the token doesn't exist, we're gonna wanna redirect the user back to the login page to make sure that they actually log in through the OAuth. However they got to where they don't have a token, they need to be redirected to a location where they have to get a token. In order to know when it's expired, we also need to know what time it is now. So in order to get the time now, we can say now is equal to int time.time, which we actually need to import the time library if we're going to use it. So up here, we can import time. All right, so now we have the current time and token info. The token has information to when it expires at, so we can check the expiration time versus the now time, and I'm actually gonna do minus now, less than 60. Checking 60 seconds here because in the case that it does expire within 60 seconds and you just didn't happen to refresh it and your API request fails, we may not know what the issue is, so this kind of makes sure to check. If is expired, we are going to go ahead and get the refresh token. So here we are going to call the refresh access token and enter our token info refresh token information. And token, we're going to just return that token info. At this point, we have most of the OAuth set up. We're gonna double check to see how it works in just a second. Let's start by creating this save discover weekly function. This is gonna get called when you go to this route here. And the first thing that we're gonna wanna do is we're going to try to get that token information. And the exception here is going to be saying like, you know, user not logged in. Case that they're not logged in, we are going to redirect them back to home. Oh, I wrote except instead of expect. Whoops. At this point, we've fully set up the OAuth. And we can now check, does this actually work? Can we get logged in? For that, I'm just gonna return OAuth successful once we hit this route. It's not really doing anything in terms of functionality other than returning that on the screen. So since we built a Flask app, we actually have to run it in order to get all of this working. And to do that, we have to get the server started. And I just realized in order to actually run our application, we need to have app.run here at the bottom so that our Flask app will start. Here we can type Python 3, Spotify weekly.py, enter. It says serving Flask app, Spotify weekly, debug mode on, running on, and then here's the address that you can navigate to. So by default, the Flask app will run on your local host on port 5000. So one thing I noticed here, there's an error in our code, and it's because here on line 54, I actually made a mistake and I forgot to add a closing bracket to this here. So that should fix that. But there's actually one more issue. I just realized that the naming convention that we use for the redirect function, redirect and redirect right here, is not great. I think it's mixing it up with the actual route. So we're just gonna name it something slightly different so that it doesn't have issues.
When you go to that address in the browser, you'll get a redirect error, and here's how you fix it.
Okay, so it's because our redirect URI is set to this. So we need to edit this and remove this one and instead set it to http://127.0.0.1,000, and then it should be redirect add. Okay, now we make sure we save that. All right, so because we added this here, we now have here that says, okay, this is the Spotify organization. So notice here how it's saying you can view your Spotify account data, view your activity on Spotify, and take action on Spotify on your behalf. This is those scopes that we talked about earlier where it's saying, okay, this is what you're allowing this app to do. So it's setting up the OAuth. I'm already logged in on the web browser in my Spotify account. So all I have to do at this point is agree. Now that this OAuth was successful, that it worked, we can actually implement the part that saves the Discover Weekly playlist to the Save Weekly playlist. So we can go ahead and initialize this SP variable, which will be the Spotify that we're going to use for all the API requests, because we're using the Spotify library to do all these requests. It takes a token info access token. The library makes things much easier, trust me. So actually use one of the Spotify library functions, which is current user playlists, and that calls that same API endpoint that we were looking at earlier in the video when we were planning. One thing that you'll notice here is when I add brackets, it'll tell you the options for the parameters are. Like you can set a limit of the number of items returned and offset. We don't want to have a limit and we don't want to have an offset here. We just want it to return all the current users playlists because we don't know where in that order the Discover Weekly playlist is for us. I know it's near the top, but that's going to return like the entire object, and we specifically want the items. Next, we're going to loop through all these playlists to find the Discover Weekly and the Save Weekly playlist. So for playlist in current playlists, so if the playlist name is equal to discover weekly. Then we are going to set this discover weekly playlist ID variable. It's kind of a long variable, but oh well. It's informative. It tells you what it does. To playlist ID. I'm just gonna copy this because we're essentially gonna do the exact same thing for saved weekly. So saved weekly, and then this part of the variable will change to saved weekly playlist ID. And if there's no discover weekly playlist ID, we can return that the discover weekly playlist was not found. We have the playlist ID, let's get the discover weekly's tracks. So discover weekly playlist. This is another one of those functions that's provided by the Spotify library, which is also similar to what we were looking at earlier, where the URL to retrieve the playlist items is this function here. Again, the parameters, playlist ID, which is required, is the first one. So we're just going to use our handy dandy variable here. I'm going to create an empty list for the song URIs because we want to take all the tracks inside of the Discover Weekly playlist, and one by one we want to add them to this list so then we can populate the Saved Weekly playlist with those tracks. Right, so for song in Discover Weekly playlist, once again, we have to target the items because it's also located in the items here. Song URI is equal to song track URI. And song URIs, dot append song URI. Here what we're doing is we're looping through every single song in the Discover Weekly playlist. We are targeting that song by its track URI. We are then taking that song URI and we are adding it to this list of songs up here so that eventually this will be populated with all, I think there's like 30 songs in total. We are calling the Spotify library one more time and we're doing the user playlist add tracks. I have to actually add in my user ID, which is like a value that represents me as a user. Be the user ID and then the saved weekly playlist. In order to actually just get this user ID, all we have to do is just call SP and then there's a current user function and it doesn't take any parameters. And that gives you information on the current user. There you can get the ID. We're just going to set that to a variable like user ID, user underscore ID. All right. Well, one more thing that we need to make sure is that if the saved weekly playlist ID does not exist, we need to create the saved weekly playlist. So real quick,
Make sure, if not, saved weekly playlist ID or SP create user playlist create function. The user ID, which I actually ended up moving up here just a second ago, it's the name of the playlist, so we're going to call it saved weekly. Public, yes, we are okay with it being public, that's fine. We can go ahead and set that to a variable so that it's saved so that we can actually get that ID from it. Set the saved weekly playlist ID equal to new playlist ID. The one thing to note here is that, we're not creating the saved weekly playlist ID until we get to this point in time, and so it's gonna have an issue, I think, here on line 47, because it's not that the value of saved weekly playlist ID will be none, but the variable itself will not exist at this point. So we actually have to create this variable somewhere up here so that there's no errors associated with this. So we're just gonna write none here.
Going to my Spotify, as you can see here, I do not have a Save Weekly playlist. I have a Discover Weekly on this list, but I don't have a Save Weekly. So what we have to do is that server and this page that's already running, and as you can see, I already ran it once. We're just going to refresh, and if we see the success message show up again, it should mean that everything that we wrote should have worked. Okay, It just refreshed, it says success again. So let's go back to our Spotify tab and see. Here we have a saved weekly playlist, and oh my gosh, it pre-populated. There we go. So we got it to work, and we also learned how to use the Spotify API. I think the biggest lesson from this video is how to use the Spotify OAuth. Hopefully you have learned from this experience. I will say that there's still another step that you can take, and that would be to take this current Flask app that's running local on your computer and actually hosting it somewhere, because that will allow it to run in the background at all times, right? Because currently it's running on localhost port 5000, which means that if you shut your computer off, it's not going to keep running on its own, and therefore it's not fully automated. And once that's set up, you can have a task runner that calls that route every single week, and because you already authenticated once, only need that refresh token, so always be running in the background. So that's an idea for you to further try. And if you guys like my video and this worked for you, go ahead and smash that like button, comment your thoughts, and please subscribe to my channel. I also recently just started a Patreon account, and if you'd like to support, the link is down below in the description. On that account, since I started about, a week ago, I actually posted a blog post on how to do all of this step by step. I'm also on Instagram and TikTok, so you can follow me there, and those links are also in the description. So y'all, I will see you soon.